Friend, this is the last of the lectures of mine on the Indian economy since 1950 or so. And in today's lecture, we will look more or less at the current period, that is the Indian economy 2019 to 21, if you like, or under the pandemic primarily. And we will hopefully have some time then toward the end of the lecture to provide an overall summary. I have also sent a large number of readings to the Institute and Academy, and you should be getting some of those readings via email. There are some basic books that you should be looking at to get a perspective, especially from the point of view of civil service exams. One is a book written by Nobel laureate Amartya Sen and Jean Dries, D-R-E-Z-E. It's about Indian development as a whole, and it's worth India and Uncertain Glory is what it's called. And it's a very comprehensive book, which gives an overall picture, but focuses especially on human development issues. The standard arguments for liberalization are given in a number of textbooks, which you can look at. I have obviously taken a position that is critical of liberalization, but there are many texts which do. For example, there is a text which was published some time ago, and maybe it's been updated, edited by a former RBI governor, Bimal Jalan, and Indian development problems and prospects, Indian economy problems and prospects, something like that, 2004 or so. There is a very good text written by two professors at JNU, Professor Chandrasekhar and Professor Jayati Ghosh, but that's again a bit dated. It's about 2005, and it's called The Market That Failed. And I have sent some chapters from that to the academy that you can look at. But you can follow my videos and then some articles of mine that I have sent to the academy, which may also be helpful. But of course, you will need to read other points of view, because this is one point of view you're getting, the other point of view. If anything, you would have seen that my point of view is somewhat different from the one you find in the business media. So it's a different, more critical approach to the process of economic development. So with those words, I would encourage you to go and read all the materials that I have sent to the academy, and which will be on sent to you. And also look at Amartya Sen and John Dries' book, as well as the one edited by Bimal Jalan, and the one authored by Chandrasekhar and Jayati Ghosh. In addition, you should be looking at Issues of Economic and Political Weekly, and of the Social Scientist, two journals that are useful. On the issues related to the agrarian economy, you have the Review of Agrarian Studies, but that may be too specialized. So I think Economic and Political Weekly, and of course you should be reading the business press, which is Mint and Economic Times and Business Standard and so on, and the usual. There are a lot of very good digital media outlets that have come in recent times, which are much more refreshing, like the Wire.in or a whole lot of others, Newsclick.in. Those are good websites. I may send you to the academy some relevant websites for you to browse. Okay, with those words, let me get down to the business of discussing the Indian economy currently. That is, we had covered the period up to the elections of 2019, which brought in the same government, but with some new members. Now we're going to look at 2019, July, or thereabouts, June, July, till now, 2020, December. It's a very difficult period, because we have been hit by two phenomena. One, that even in July 2019, as I had made it clear in my lecture 2 days ago, or yesterday, that the Indian economy had begun to slow down. It had begun to slow down following the disastrous impacts of demonetization, followed by a poorly designed and badly implemented GST, goods and services tax, neither of which justified the claims made for them by their proponents, but were in fact especially harmful to the informal sector and especially to the small, medium and marginal players in the system, especially harmful to the unorganized sector, to workers, to farmers and so on. It may have at best benefited a very small handful of people. Even that is a dubious proposition as far as demonetization is concerned. GST was mainly intended to create something like an all-India market for big business in India, domestic and foreign. But in the process, it ended up eroding seriously the rights of state government, which are elected governments, which have a certain amount of limited sovereignty over the territory, which are based on linguistic nationality considerations, therefore represent important units of the Indian Union. India itself is considered in the Constitution the union of states, but unfortunately the importance given to states has been declining very sharply with the growth of the Indian economy and the rise of national big business and its international connections. So it's important because each Indian state has at least a few, 30, 40 million people, or 100 million people, 80 million people. So these are big. The Tamil Nadu economy, Tamil Nadu has a population of around 80 million, which is about as big as Britain or Germany or, some of the European states. So it's important, I think, to recognize that the Indian economy can only flourish if the states have adequate powers and resources and the flexibility to determine their policies on the ground. The government of India is too far removed from the ground to be able to design policies. And it's a pity that we have an unnecessarily large degree of over-centralization in economic policy. And today we will see evidence in the handling of the pandemic also of this unfortunate over-centralization. Anyway, that's a longer-term issue that requires many steps before we can go back to the original constitutional promise of federal India. India has become much more unitary than it should be. That's my view. I mean, there are others who think that all power should be vested in one individual, and that individual is like some god, and that god will deliver India from all evil. That's not my view. My view is that we need a much more collective approach which recognizes diversity and plurality of the Indian economy and Indian society in terms of a number of variables. So again, I won't elaborate. Coming back to the economy, as I mentioned yesterday, by 2019 July, when the new NDA government presented its budget, things had begun to change quite rapidly for the worse for the Indian economy. We had already mentioned the problems of unemployment, decline in consumption, per capita consumption, and the continuing agrarian crisis. These were to continue into the current period as well, and in particular, the collapse of purchasing power of the broad masses of the population was a key factor in the slowing down of economic growth from the mid-2019 period. Industry leaders, captains of industry, went public, held press conferences, and said that we are finding it very difficult to sell two-wheelers, four-wheelers, and so on. And, the somewhat absurd notion that people weren't buying cars because they were using Ola and Uber, of course, has been completely, disproved by subsequent developments. But it was not just cars and automobiles and trucks and so on, because trucks, of course, Ola and Uber don't come in there. But even with, not just the automobile sector, biscuit manufacturers were saying that they could not sell 5 rupee biscuit packets. It was that serious, a decline in purchasing power. So there was a demand crisis of the economy. This much is evident by August, September 2019, although the Union budget presented in July 2019 did not recognize this. And in fact, the 2019 July budget had all its numbers quite dubious and more or less is not taken seriously. I have called it in one of my writings a non-budget, but that's maybe one way of saying it. But most of the numbers in the 2019 Union budget turned out to be grossly erroneous, and therefore most serious analysts have not taken that budget very seriously. But in any event, the budget got overturned and by subsequent events completely. And what were the subsequent events? One I mentioned, namely the corporate captains of industry coming and saying that there is a serious demand problem, that we are not able to sell not just automobiles, but even biscuits and so on. The government of India did not officially recognize that there is a big slowdown. The data were coming in, but there is such a huge mess in the Indian data system now, thanks to the weakening of the statistical system, just like there's been weakening of many other institutions of governance in India, whether it be the banking system, the RBI, the Election Commission, or any number of institutions, or the investigative agencies, which are being seen as being politically motivated by some people. So there's a serious lack of trust in many institutions. India's statistical system was one of the most respected statistical systems, especially for a developing country, and even better than many other developed countries as well. But now there's a big cloud that hangs around India's statistical system and its data gathering agencies, because they have been partially subordinated to larger political interests. That's a problem that we can't do much about, but we can only say that independent evidence suggested, and this is not disputed by many people in government either, although they were not acknowledged by them either, there was a decline in the Indian economy which was bringing down the growth rate significantly. And evidence that came later in the financial year 2018-19, came towards the last quarter of 2019, that is the January, February, March, and of this year, it was very clear that the economy was not, of 2019, the economy wasn't doing very well, but when the budget came in July 2019, it didn't recognize all this. And then we had this industrialist saying, there were many people who came on board and said, we have a problem. And while the government did not officially acknowledge the slowdown in the economy, it did take certain measures. What were the measures the government took? One, the government responded to the concerns of foreign speculative finance capital coming into the Indian stock market and playing speculation. The budget had imposed a surcharge on the capital gains tax on stock market transactions. And this was seen as a negative signal by foreign finance capital investors from abroad, and of course domestic players as well. So in order to appease this section of speculative investors in stock markets, and especially foreign capitalists investing in the stock market, the Minister of Finance decided to withdraw the surcharge on capital gains tax in the stock market. And that was to cost the government about roughly 10,000 crore rupees, according to the ministry. The second important measure, which was taken after some more time, because the slowdown did not go away, the slowdown continued, and popular pressures were articulated by not ordinary people, but the captains of industry. And so the finance minister came up with a second round of measures, which involved roughly 50,000 crore rupees for additional export subsidies, again going to a handful of corporate entities mostly, and an additional 20,000 crore rupees concessions on housing and real estate, of which 10,000 crores was to be borne by the government of India and 10,000 was to come from other sources. So this adds up to about altogether 10 plus 50 plus 20, 80 crore, 80,000 crores by September or so. Then came the big announcement, which was in response to continued concerns expressed by the corporate sector, the finance minister announced a sharp reduction in the overall corporate tax rate, reducing it to a flat 22%. And this is independent of the annual turnover of the company. Because earlier in 2000, I don't remember the exact year, during Mr. Jaitley's term as finance minister, I think it was 2016-17, he had actually introduced a measure which lowered the tax rate on corporate entities with an annual turnover of 250 crores or less. A reduced tax rate of 25% was to be applicable to them. But the rest of them were to stay at the 30%. When Mrs. Sitharaman became finance minister in her first budget, she raised this 250 crores to 400 crores. So if all corporate entities with an annual turnover of 400 crore rupees or less were entitled to pay a lower tax at 25%. Now, these are all measures that lost revenue for the government. Also in this period, Government of India announced the abolition of the wealth tax and numerous other concessions which I'm not listing here. But all this wasn't felt to be enough. So Mrs. Sitharaman in 2019, I don't remember the exact date, September, October, but made a dramatic announcement saying that without any reference to turnover, for all corporate entities, the corporate income tax rate shall be brought down to a flat 22%. Now, she, according to the finance ministry's estimates and the minister's own statement, this would entail a revenue loss of 1,45,000 crores to the Government of India. So if we add up the 80,000 crores already given away, again to a fairly small number of entities, to this 1.45 lakh crores, you have about 2.25 lakh crores of tax concessions and other bonanzas to the big corporate entities by and large. Others also may benefit to some extent, but by and large, the corporate entity that will benefit substantially. And this was followed up in the union budget of the 1st of February 2020 by a further concession in direct taxes of the order of 65,000 crores. So essentially, you can say that even before the pandemic arrived in India, which is just about that time, pandemic arrived in India on the 30th of January 2020, when the first case was detected in Kerala, and Kerala immediately applied very stringent measures to try and minimize the spread. They initially succeeded. Subsequently, it's been more difficult. But initially, they took some excellent measures for which they've been recognized by the whole world. But immediately then, it was clear that the pandemic had arrived in India. And so when the pandemic arrived, we were already slowing down significantly. And the Government of India had already given away 3 lakh crore rupees worth of annual tax concessions to the most powerful, economically most powerful segment of the Indian economy, namely the Indian corporate sector, and of course also other corporate entities operating in India. This was the context in which the government also, in the budget, announced that in order to minimize the budgetary deficit, which is a concern because, the fiscal deficit, which I have mentioned earlier to you, was seen as having to be minimized in order to retain the confidence of foreign finance capital. If fiscal deficits were high, foreign capitalists would be reluctant to invest in the Indian markets because they will be afraid that the economy could suffer because of decline in the value of the currency and so on. So that was one important consideration. Give me a minute. Yeah, 1 second. My connector just fell. So. Yeah. So, one important consideration was, if India has a large deficit, and remember what I had mentioned to you about how the fiscal deficit is defined. It's very important to understand this. The fiscal deficit is defined Yeah, sorry, back. Hello. Sorry, there's a brief disruption. The net connection is.
You continue, sir. No problem.
Continue, Budlama.
Sir.
Okay, so I was just explaining to you when we got disconnected the term fiscal deficit, which is very important. I mentioned to you that we have an act called the FRBM Act, Fiscal Responsibility and Budget Management Act in this country, passed in 2004 and notified by the UPA 1 government. But what is the concept? A fiscal deficit is a concept that says you take the total expenditure of government and subtract from that the receipts of the government, which are considered legitimate. What are the legitimate, quote unquote legitimate? What are the legitimate receipts? Taxes, surpluses of government-owned enterprises, charges levied for services provided by government, plus income from the sale, capital received from the sale of government-owned assets. In other words, disinvestment or privatization. What is not eligible, what is not legitimate in the definition of fiscal deficit as a receipt is the borrowing by the government. In other words, the fiscal deficit is defined as total government expenditure minus non-debt receipts. Only receipts which are not debt are counted. This is very much a World Bank IMF inspired concept, which essentially delegitimizes government borrowing. It says government should not borrow. Government has no business to be in business. And in the process, it encourages the sale of government-owned enterprises, which is basically privatization. So the fiscal deficit concept and the insistence that countries limit their fiscal deficits is to serve the interests of global finance capital, which wants to be free of government interference and would like much reduced role for government wherever it goes. And so they are the ones who are pushing this low fiscal deficit, partly because they associate large fiscal deficit with inflation, which in turn will affect the value of the currency they deal in, and that might cost them losses. So finance capital is very averse. The government involvement in the economy generally as an ideological principle, but also more specifically, large government deficits, which they think might erode the value of the currency and later cause them problems. So in a sense, because of the very strong power of global finance capital, backed of course by the powerful governments of the Western world, the US and the G7 as a whole and so on, many countries have fallen in line and have tried to maintain low fiscal deficits, meaning that they are trying to reduce borrowing and mobilize receipts by not borrowing. But the question then comes, if they don't mobilize resources by borrowing, what do they do? How do they mobilize resources? As I said, we have taxes, surpluses of enterprises, and charges levied for services. But these, well, the government seeks to raise these things. They raise fertilizer prices, they raise PDS prices, they try to reduce subsidies and all that. But the point to note is that the government does not seek to mobilize resources by effective taxation, but rather relies on disinvestment, which is basically selling away people's assets, not government's assets. And secondly, it relies on reduction of expenditure on many items. So it is in India, the policies that we follow can be called fiscal deficit reduction primarily through expenditure reduction. This seriously affects fertilizer prices, affects agriculture, industry. The smaller, the more informal segments of the population are seriously affected. Welfare measures are affected, expenditure on health is affected, and education is affected. But what is not affected, of course, what is in fact, who benefits under a regime of this kind is the corporate sector, which gets huge tax concessions in the name of incentivizing the corporate sector for investment and growth. So I think this fiscal deficit obsession has to be seen for what it is. It is pushed by the international financial institutions like the World Bank and the Fund. It has had no theoretical status in economic theory originally. Now they're trying to invent some justification for it. But Government of India, especially the present government, has been a very, very sincere and uncritical follower of the doctrine of reduction of fiscal deficit. So in the 2019 budget, or 2020 budget, February budget, once the corporate sector had been given this 3 lakh crore rupees worth of concessions, Government of India was obliged to try and bring down the fiscal deficit primarily by cutting back expenditure and also by selling public sector assets. That is a non-debt receipt. So essentially, fiscal deficit targets are utilized to promote disinvestment and privatization. And that's essentially what happened in India's case. The budget provided for a whopping 2.1 lakh crore rupees by way of disinvestment, including disinvestment in such star companies as Bharat Petroleum, a very well-functioning, Bharat Petrochemical Corporation, very well-functioning, Bharat Petroleum Corporation, very well-functioning company, making considerable profits. Also LIC of India, which has won the confidence of about 45% of our population, but Government of India wants to list LIC in the stock markets and sell off some portion of its share. Government of India paid almost nothing for the LIC. Only initial investment of 5 crores of equity investment. And then later on, LIC simply grew and grew and grew to the point where it has still, despite privatization being carried out in 1994, it's about 26 years ago, LIC still commands close to 80% of the life insurance market. It's been a fantastic competitor with a great record on settlement of claims and all this. Globally, a #1 company in terms of claim settlement and so on, and yet Government of India wants to privatize it. This is coming from the desire to expand the space for private players, and this is something that both big business domestically and foreign capital are very happy about. They keep pushing for these policies. But for ordinary people, the consequences can be quite serious. In any event, this was the idea that you give away 3 lakh crores of tax concessions and you try and recoup it by selling off people's assets for 2.1 lakh crores. Because remember, there's not government assets. The government assets for the day, but the governments come and go. So the normal justification is we have a parliamentary sanction. We've got it through parliament. So parliamentary sanction is only for a certain gross amount, not for specific disinvestments. So anyway, that's the system we have. We have the governments in office having the power to sell off public sector or people's assets. And that's a separate issue that I'm not considering here. What is the meaning of all this? So with all this, the economy was not able to pick up. The government of India was curbing its spending. It was giving away tax breaks and a lot of money for the big guys. And in the process, it had less and less to spend on ordinary people's demands or needs. And like such, for example, the National Rural Employment Guarantee Act required you to provide 100 days of employment to rural households, but you were not able to do it. You cut back real terms outlay on MNREGS, you cut back outlays on fertilizer subsidies and food subsidies and so on. So all these meant higher input costs for farmers, lower output prices, rising inflation for ordinary people, especially with the constant rise in excise duty that I had mentioned to you yesterday on petroleum prices, which Government of India has been engaged in continuously from 2014 onwards. So all of this meant that the sources of demand were drying up. What are the sources of demand in an economy? You would know from your micro and macroeconomics reading that you may have done that there are basically 4 sources of demand in an economy. One is private consumption expenditure. Second is private investment expenditure. Third is government expenditure. And the fourth is exports. Now, in the period we're discussing, the world economy is also slowing down considerably. 2018, 19, 19, 20. The world economy is not growing rapidly. So, your export markets are not growing at all. They're tanking, in fact. And the only reason you don't have a disaster on your hands is because imports are also tanking because of the collapse of growth. But given that exports are not expanding, given that private consumer expenditure, as I explained last time, had sharply fallen because from the National Sample Survey data on consumer expenditure, and given further that the private investors had become very reluctant to invest given the collapse of demand in the market, the only item which could have given a boost to the economy would have been government expenditure. But Government of India was so committed to reducing fiscal deficit that it would not increase its expenditures significantly. So as a result, the slowdown continued and progressively got worse, so that by the time we come to the end of the financial year 2019-20, which is March 31st, 2020, Government of India had to report. And we think this is also an overestimate, but the Government of India ultimately finally reported rate of growth of GDP for 2019-20, which is a little less than 4%. Our own assessment is more like 2%, 1.8%, but officially it's about close to 4%. A considerable decline from earlier claims of 8% and 7% growth and so on. Okay, so this is one part of it. So in other words, the point that I want to establish here is that the current slowdown or negative growth of the Indian economy is not simply an outcome of the lockdown imposed following the pandemic. Lockdown is no doubt a major contributor to the sharp decline in GDP, a negative growth of GDP, but the slowdown in GDP growth has already begun from 2019 early onwards and had intensified by the time you had come to the January of this year, when the pandemic arrived at the end of January. This is one point to note. So even before the pandemic arrived, Indian economy was in bad shape. It was characterized by massive unemployment, agrarian crisis, and decline in purchasing power of the population, was facing a serious demand crisis, and faced a world economy where exports were not expanding either. So the headroom for government was quite limited. Now, this is one part of the story. Next, we can look at how the government responded to the pandemic itself. So the pandemic was first reported on January 30th in Kerala, as I said, but the Government of India did not take it seriously until much later. Well, we don't know if they took it seriously or not. They took no serious measures because their attention was turned elsewhere. In fact, the health ministry even much later was poo-pooing the idea of a pandemic. Even when the WHO was engaged in deciding whether it was a global pandemic or not, took a little time and then decided it is a global pandemic. Ministry of Health and Government of India was not, so concerned with it. There were reasons. There was a visit by the American President Trump to Gujarat. And then there were issues like the change of government in Madhya Pradesh, which were all up in the air at that time. And some of these issues got resolved by late March. And we had the first major step by Government of India, which is the declaration of a countrywide lockdown, coming in on the 24th of March. A full 2 months into the pandemic. But this is a terrible pandemic, and nobody should underestimate the challenge of facing it. So I don't think it's a question of scoring debating points or anything. But what is the idea of a lockdown? The idea of a lockdown is to prevent spread, right? So you're trying to minimize the rate at which the contagion spreads. But it is not a solution. It just basically buys you time, maybe by curbing the spread of the pandemic through isolation, distancing and all that, and lockdown of a lot of activities. You are buying time because your public health infrastructure, because of long years of liberalization and lack of investment in public health institutions, is in bad shape. So if the pandemic arrives and spreads rapidly, the hospitals cannot handle it. There won't be enough beds and enough ICUs and enough equipment. You needed ventilators, you needed personal protective equipment for doctors and nurses and sanitary personnel and others in the hospitals. So there's a big challenge. So since we had for very long spent so little on health, all the Government of India's and state government's expenditure put together on health was not even 1% of GDP. And even now it's hardly 1% of GDP. And we had commercialized health massively in the last 20, 30 years. Under liberalization, health has become a private affair. And India has one of the worst records in terms of the proportion of total health expenditure in this country that is met by what is called out-of-pocket expenditure. That is spent by people themselves, not at all given by the government. That's about close to 80%. It's a scandal. No other country has this kind of no other major country has this kind of a bad ratio. We are among the worst in terms of commercialization of healthcare and denial of the people's right to health. But that's, now it is no time to be bemoaning it. It is a fact. So the idea of the lockdown was to try and buy time to improve health infrastructure and then face the pandemic. But unfortunately, that process was not very successful. First of all, what was the problem with the announcement of the lockdown? One, there was hardly any notice. It was announced on the day with about 4 hours of notice. All transport was stopped, which is a huge, crisis for migrant workers living very far from their families in metropolitan centers. Families were in villages in Bihar and UP and elsewhere, and they could not even get home. And finally, many of them walked hundreds of kilometers. Some of them died. Many of them starved. Many of them did not have access to water. Although all these points were being denied in courts of law by the agencies of government, fact was that there was a massive human catastrophe that we were watching on our television screens. And there was little relief for them. What did the government do about the pandemic? One, as I said, the idea was to build infrastructure and try and get ready for the surge when it came, because there will be huge surges of people getting infected and coming to the hospitals. The state governments were the ones handling the problem on the ground, and they should have been empowered with both financial powers and decision-making powers. That did not happen. In fact, if anything, decision-making during the pandemic got more and more centralized. State governments had to wait for Government of India to tell them what to do, even if they were clear about what they wanted to do. Kerala, of course, went ahead and did many things, but not all state governments were proactive. So there was a serious problem for state governments in terms of decision-making authority, by the sharing of power and so on. But also, state governments are financially very, hampered in terms of the lack of support from the Government of India for handling the pandemic-related expenditures. It's also tragic because as the economy had slowed down massively, revenues fell, and therefore Government of India's revenues also fell, and the state government's revenues also fell because of the share of the overall revenues. In particular, GST practically collapsed, GST revenues, and the burden on the state governments was immense. And the government of India, for its part, citing its own fiscal crisis, was not willing to pay the states the required GST compensation, thus violating a solemn promise made in the GST Act. Under special circumstances, is what they would say. But all of this meant that the state governments were facing a huge, huge challenge on the ground. They were the ones to whom people would turn. People can't turn to Delhi for everything, right? So the state governments were the ones who had to take the blame, but they're also the ones who had to do the work on the ground, and they were not empowered by the government of India significantly. Most decisions were taken above and imposed on the state governments. Hardly any consultation was involved. Circumstances were difficult, I'll grant that, but even then, the tendency to centralize powers has been there from 2014, we have seen, and even earlier in previous regimes also, but particularly in the regimes after 2014, demonetization and kind of GST that was brought about, all of that. So this now, GST was a disaster for them. It was not giving them revenue, and state governments were getting starved. The economy was tanking, so government of India's revenues also fell. They could not provide much relief to the states. This was the context in which there was this tragic phenomenon of migrants being left in the lurch without being provided shelter or clothing and having to manage somehow when they lost their jobs and as a result of lockdown. So one question, of course, is whether the lockdown should have been countrywide and of the same severity, because later on we have now more differentiated lockdowns. Even if was it not possible to make an assessment if we had proper monitoring system of the extent of contagion and its nature in different parts of the country, and therefore accordingly have a more differentiated strategy vis-a-vis lockdown as a temporary measure to gain time to build public health infrastructure. Now that's a question that will remain. I think it's a good argument that we should have been more careful. We should have had a more differentiated approach because not all parts of the country were equally affected by the pandemic at the end of March 2020. But nonetheless, the government of India went in for a countrywide lockdown and also stopped all transport, which is a huge problem for the people. Understandable because of the fears of contagion, but nonetheless, very, very difficult situation for the people. Also, this national lockdown meant a huge loss of jobs and livelihood. And, complete break of the supply chains, total disruption in production. All of this is very severe in its impact on ordinary people, on the informal sector especially, agriculture and the informal sector. Later, a few days later, the government the finance ministry announced a relief program. But in that relief program, which the government of India claimed was 1.7 lakh crore rupees worth, many of the schemes are already part of the 20 February budget. So you could really actually add up only about 93,000 crores as the new expenditure for relief, and that's hardly 0.5% of India's GDP. There were measures taken by the RBI, and later on on May 12th, the Prime Minister announced a 20 lakh crore package, as he called it. But this package is not one of expenditure, mostly one of loans, terms concerning loans, deferment, that sort of thing. And the actual expenditure in the second package also by Government of India was hardly 1 lakh crore rupees. So the earlier 0.93 plus another 1 lakh crore. There was a significant step up in the number of days of employment to be made available under MNREGS, but huge exodus to the countryside had taken place by then. So the demand for jobs was far, far greater than the increase in government allocation would have allowed. So again, the rural employment scenario remained very bleak. The urban employment scenario remained bleak. Livelihoods of people had been badly affected. But the most tragic part of the whole thing was that despite a lot of economists and political parties urging the government of India to provide immediate relief in the form of two things. One, grain at the rate of 10 kilograms per adult per month for all the pandemic affected households which were not part of the income tax paying population. 80% of India's households essentially had to be reached and could have been reached. So one demand was 10 kilograms of grain, and we had at that point in time about 7.5 crore tons of food grains with FCA's godowns could have been distributed instead of having discussions on whether it should be used for sanitizers. A terrible discussion. But anyway, I'll not get into that. So, Government of India did not believe in spending. They believed in enabling through monetary policy some liquidity. But that is no solution to the crisis. So a lot of the measures were taken by RBI, and all of that, those amounts are included in the so-called 20 lakh crore package. And the real effective expenditure was far less. Together, the two rounds of expenditure together amount to hardly 1% of GDP, according to various international agency estimates, including financial agencies of various kinds, which are generally neoliberal in their outlook. Even they had to admit that the expenditure was hardly 1.5%. The economists and the opposition parties had also said that apart from this grain, for about 3 to 6 months, provide 7,500 rupees a month per household to all these households. That will help them tide over, and once they start spending, the economy can pick up and revive. But we had a supply disruption with the supply chains breaking up, and we had a huge demand disruption with an already impoverished rural and urban economy getting impoverished further and being unable to create any demand for goods and services. So production was not likely to recover quickly. And this is the scenario that we faced at that time. Then we have had now several months after that, we have had some data. We've had a lot of, I must say, sadly, avoidable deaths. Currently, we have a very large number of COVID cases, among the highest in the world, next to the US, and it's possible that we may overtake the US at some point. And this is one area where we wouldn't want to be number one, but we could very well be number one in this. It's true that the deaths have been not on the same scale as in the US, greater. Whatever reasons, I'm not getting into why that is so, but the strain on the health system has been enormous, and a lot of people have died who shouldn't have died. And a lot of people who shouldn't have contracted COVID if had been more active and had better designed policies to deal with both the health aspects and the economic aspects of the pandemic. Now we have some data which has come since then, and I am going to have to rush this because I want to keep some 15 minutes for an overall summing up. And the data tell us that while the pandemic is going on, and I'm not going to discuss the pandemic and its health measures so much now, I'm going to focus on the economy. The results for the first quarter of 2020-21, which consists of the months of April, May, and June of this year, show a decline of 24%, according to the government, in GDP corresponding to the same quarter last year, 2019, April, May, June. There has been some slowing down of the sharp decline. So the decline in the second quarter is more of the order of about 8.5% compared to the corresponding quarter in the previous year. But taken together, the two half years taken together, you take the half year of March-September 2019, April-September 2019, and compare that with April-September 2020, you get a decline in GDP of the order of about 15.5%. By the official data, it is likely to be more like 20%. Most people feel the Government of India is not estimating the decline accurately. The decline is more like 20%. The government has an incentive not to show it as so bad. But 15 or 20% decline in GDP is a huge issue. It is true that even in the periods when GDP was rising, poor did not benefit much, that is true. But when it is declining, the poor get massively affected. And everybody, not just poor, even 80%, as I said, of the population. So we have a major economic crisis, even taking into account both the first and second quarter, and it's likely, despite government and industry and the business press making positive noises, my own assessment is that you're not likely to end up the year 2021 with any kind of recovery which implies either zero growth or some growth. The growth rate of GDP over the entire year 2021 is likely to be of the order of minus 10% or thereabouts. This is the assessment that most economists are coming to, maybe even a little higher. But I don't see it coming down much. So there we are. We have not handled the pandemic well. We have created huge distress for ordinary people. The handling of migrants is terrible. The failure to provide relief to the mass of the population was sad. And this has resulted in huge hunger and avoidable deaths and illnesses and other kinds of misery for ordinary people. So, and this is directly the consequence of our obsession with minimizing the fiscal deficit, minimizing government expenditure, and also the unnecessary and very large concessions given to the corporate sector, which led to the government having to squeeze its own expenditure subsequently. So there is clearly room for a different set of economic policies here. An immediate implementation of a relief package would be very helpful, and then that would help pick up demand over a period of time. Otherwise, I don't see the Indian economy recovering. Not just in 2021, but even 21, 22 will be pretty much a washout. That's a sad position we are in. I will leave to sum up, the government's handling of the pandemic was poor, in my view. Decisions were overly centralized. Very symbolic gestures were resorted to, but substantive action was very weak. State governments were not given adequate powers and finances to deal with the issue. They were not even given their dues in terms of GST, etc. And there was also non-transparency in terms of how the government of India financed expenditures in relation to the pandemic, including the questions that have been raised around the so-called PM CARES fund. So these are controversial issues. I don't want to get to them, but just flag them for you to read the literature and come to your own conclusion. But serious questions have been raised about the lack of transparency in the PM CARES fund and also the opaqueness of Government of India's decision-making policies and procedures and their failure to adequately consult and respond to the concerns of the state governments. In fact, worse, this has been, and this is the last point I want to make, there is a perception now that Government of India has actually used the pandemic and the associated lockdown to rush through a number of very sharp, very extreme policy measures which should have been resisted to a much greater extent had it been normal times. One of the dignitaries of the government, Amitabh Kant of the Niti Aayog, has actually said, and I quote, that we have too much democracy in India. We should cut down democracy, This is the best. He says, all these reforms, farm laws and labor law abolition, time is now. So there's such a sense of urgency being displayed to pass legislation on which there is no consensus. As you see now in the huge farmers' agitation, as you saw in the huge workers' mobilization on November 26th, across the country, workers and farmers are not accepting Government of India's legislative measures pushed through in a hurry in Parliament without adequate discussion and using the pandemic by way of labor law amendments and by way of the 3 farm laws. These are meeting with huge resistance on the ground despite the pandemic conditions and the associated restrictions on mobilizing. You saw the amount of mobilization in the Delhi border. You've seen mobilizations across the country. It's not a Punjab, Haryana affair. It is a countrywide affair where farmers from all parts of the country are participating massively despite the pandemic. Likewise with the workers' strike. And so, we have unleashed a huge popular protest by being utterly undemocratic and taking measures on the economy which had no universal consensus, nor had they been discussed widely enough in the country for a decision to be taken. And this is something that's very serious. It's going to impact on Indian democracy in the future. It will impact on the credibility of government institutions and so on. And in fact, the less we talk about it, the better, because there is so much to be discussed there. But let me, I'll invite you to read my article which I've sent to the academy and also discuss among yourselves, read the press, and don't have to buy what I'm saying. You can look at the counter narratives as well. Finally, in the remaining 15 minutes, I'd just like to say that our overall, tour, academic tour, if you like, of the Indian economy from 1952 to 2020, a very quick tour of about 70 years of India's development, give us a few lessons. One, in retrospect, you can see that the role of planning, public sector, and the entire state initiatives in development from the period 50 to 90 or till about 97 have been extremely important in creating a self-reliant Indian economy, notwithstanding their own limitations and their own implications as between the rich and the poor. I wouldn't say they were particularly pro-poor, but I would say they were growth-oriented and created an infrastructure that was then utilized by subsequent, periods. That's one. So it had its limitations. It was a major limitation was that it was based on not taxation of the well-to-do, but imposing taxes on the ordinary people, and it couldn't last beyond the point. And agrarian structures had not been transformed. That was an important reason for the mid-1950s crisis. And of course, India's forex situation has always remained precarious for lack of an adequate emphasis on self-reliance and domestic production. Because India's business has remained largely imitative and not innovative by and large. Now, post-1980, the world changed dramatically. Finance capital became more and more dominant. And India had to tweak its policies in order to deal with that, but also the fact that the Indian business classes, which had been quite weak at the time of independence, had become much more prosperous and powerful in the 40 years from 50 to 90, using government subsidies and government investments and all that. They fattened themselves and became very powerful economically and politically. And so by 1990, they were beginning to demand much larger share in policy making, and that they would determine policy and so on. This is one side of the story. The other side, of course, was the global changes, that the collapse of the USSR, Eastern European socialisms, the rise of a unipolar world, the rise of right-wing neoliberal economic policies across the world, the rise of right-wing Hindutva religious mobilization in India. All of this, visualized, meant that the 1990s onwards would be a much more right-wing Indian and global scenario. And that's how it has been. What has been the record for the period of economic reforms from 1990? It's something we've discussed several times, but now we can sum it up by saying that the overall growth rate of GDP for this period of 30 years is possibly even marginally less than the rate of growth for the 1980s, but perhaps not significantly. So we can say, practically, we can say India has been growing at about 6% per annum for the last 30 years, and that's an impressive rate of growth, historically speaking. So India has diversified, has become a bigger economy and so on, but of course population has also grown. So in per capita terms, the growth has been more modest, but nonetheless, economic growth is an area where China has been growing faster, but India is among the more rapidly growing developing countries. And this rapid growth is not attributable to any very particular government or a particular personality or individual. It is the product of capitalist development in a specific historical setting and in a changing international setting. So I will leave it at that. I won't go into allocating blame and credit here, but we also saw that the period from 1991 to 2014, while it was neoliberal, it was not characterized by unilateral, highly centralized decision making. The more of a measured way of decision making there within neoliberal policy frame. And because of the pressures from civil society and the left political forces, between 2004 and 2008, we actually had some pro-people measures also implemented in this period. But the subsequent period has been different. And when discussing that, it is also important to remember that while 1991 saw the global triumph of capitalism, the period since 2008 saw also the major crisis of capitalism and the difficulty, therefore, of going on the old way as capitalism would. So once the global economic crisis of 2008 occurred, and I have sent articles to you that might help you understand it. The hegemony of capitalism was once again challenged. Just 1 second, just 1 second. Yeah, there's some disturbance. I hope you're able to hear me. Am I audible? I hope so. Anyway.
Yes, sir. Fine, sir. You can continue, sir.
Kekda?
Kekkudu, sir.
Some external noise, I think. Okay, so we have only about 10 minutes anyway. So what we can say is that the global economy has also been undergoing change. So if 1991 saw the setbacks of socialism and the rise of a unipolar world, subsequent 30 years have also shown that the global capitalist system is unable to solve certain basic problems of people, like poverty or unemployment or destruction of nature, the ecological crisis, the climate change crisis. So across the world, there is a much greater level of dissatisfaction with the ruling economic policies of the neoliberal kind. Neoliberalism in the Western world certainly has lost much of its sheen, much of its popularity. And elections in country after country, including, for example, in Britain, where the Brexit happening in the case of the US, Trump's policies of selective deglobalization had a popular appeal. Across the world now, there's a tendency to question indiscriminate globalization and also to reassert, to some extent, the role of the state in shaping economic growth and development. There's a greater clamor for policies to be changed to serve the interests of the larger sections of the population, the broad mass of the population, and not just the corporate elite. So there is a reaction to corporate domination of policy making, to technological domination, and to the very close relationship that has developed between big business and government in many countries of the world, including ours. Because ours is now famously discussed and names are being floated as to which set of businessmen are most influential with government and so on, but across the world. And is reflected also in matters like political funding. For example, our own electoral bond scheme is a classic example of non-transparent political financing of elections by large private corporate entities without knowing who they are funding and why. So when a particular regime gets elected, then it has a quid pro quo. It has to pay back for the money it has received from corporate groups. This is happening, again, it's not specific to India, but it's been so dramatically talked about in India. The Association for Democratic Reforms has put out a lot of numbers on this. But across the world also, this is a global phenomenon. So modern capitalism on a global scale, you could argue, is in a state of significant crisis. Doesn't mean it's going to collapse tomorrow. It just means that there are issues being raised, and these issues are much wider appeal than they had earlier, questioning the logic of a profit-driven economic system and demanding that there be greater socialization of the economic system and greater sharing of the benefits of growth and a greater concern for the environment, that it can't all be about profit. It has to be about sustainable development and also about democracy and participation. These are the new values. And yet we have in this country, quite the contrary, we have an environmental impact assessment notification that during a pandemic period when people can't even mobilize, that basically does away with all environmental criteria or caution in sanctioning large industrial projects without even a EIA being carried out. So that's being contested. I mean, things are being contested across the world. And we have seen this whole vaccine business, and that should make you think that if a life-saving vaccine becomes a purely profit-driven activity, what will happen to humanity? Are there not some considerations that should say that no, this cannot be profit-maximizing business? These vaccines have to be made available to everybody. But then you have the strange phenomenon of certain political parties promising vaccine if they are voted upon. Vaccine is a matter of right of Indian people. If the vaccine comes along and the state is unable to protect people from the pandemic, at least the vaccine should be allowed to do so. And people shouldn't have to pay for it. And yet we have these big disputes and dilemmas that we are facing currently. And I think the record of the last several years of Indian economy remind you that the neoliberal path, even in times of growth, does not carry benefits to the ordinary people, especially to farmers and workers, informal sector and so on. And we therefore need to review and reconsider these economic policies of leaving everything to the corporate sector and their profit maximizing zeal, but rather that the government should come in. There should be decentralization, first of all. It can't all be central government. We must create a decentralization of economic powers to the states, including a serious revision of the GST and maybe even going back to providing states greater powers, state governments greater powers of taxation, better devolution of resources collected by the government of India and the states on behalf of all the Indian people. A more responsive polity with decentralization going not just to the state government but further down to the elected local bodies. Much greater spending at the local level made accountable. Comprehensive land reforms, because the lack of access to productive assets is the key factor behind rural distress. And we need to make land available to every agrarian household in India. Not every household in India, but not every household in rural India either, but the agrarian households which are cultivating or which are seeking to cultivate, we must be able to provide, and we can. We have about 400 million acres of cultivable land in the country. We can provide on an average 1 hectare of land for every cultivating agrarian household. And if we can do that, we can provide a basis for livelihood, because at the end of the day, a household makes a livelihood by either owning a productive asset and deriving income from it, or getting productive employment that pays it a wage or an income, or a combination. So we need to provide every rural household and urban household the ability to eke out a living through its own assets, or if not, through its productive employment. So employment should be a major consideration in policy, and not merely playing with growth numbers. Decentralization should be important. Environment should be central to the concerns of policy makers. And the entire logic of neoliberal policies needs to be understood and overthrown. We need to go back to a popularly participatory and more egalitarian path of development, where governments at different levels will play different roles, but will play some role. And the people, through their own organizations, will also play an important role in policy making. But policy making is not to be the preserve of a handful of corporates and of bureaucrats who are in sync with those corporates, or of politicians who are in sync with those corporates. So I think these are the lessons that we need to draw. Not easy, easier said than done. But if you're looking at the vision of a bright, democratic and prosperous India of the future, it has to be one where all this has to be done, especially, for example, to give you one example, education, which I'm just finishing. The new education policy goes directly against the interests of building a resilient, democratic and educated India. We need far more institutions at the local level, so that kids don't have to go far distances to do tertiary education. We need far greater autonomy to higher educational institutions so they can creatively think and innovate and so on. Similarly, we need far greater investment at all levels of education, and especially also for R&D. Likewise, we need a great deal more investment for public health and for infrastructure. And the conclusion, therefore, is that we need a much more effective system of taxation of the well-to-do and the use of direct taxes, including wealth tax and estate duty, and which are not there now, when we brought back. And we must have an effective income tax system, all of which can then raise resources for financing popular development for the people as a whole. And that's really where we need to, I think, rethink our whole model of development. Those words, I'm going to conclude my lecture. Thank you. போலாமா?
Thank you, sir.